Greetings, class. This is Professor McKenzie again. Today we're going to be looking at Chapter 4, which is titled The Constitutional Law and U.S. Commerce. I believe most of you by now in your college, kind of track, you've already had government, whether it's maybe in high school, you might have had like either U.S. government or AP U.S. government, or you might have just had government here in college. And so we're going to kind of hit some of the highlights of the Constitution and government in the context of how it impacts businesses. So that's kind of going to be like our focus. So a lot of this hopefully will be a review for you. So it should be a quick chapter to kind of go through. In terms of the learning objectives, I want us to understand first the basic structure of the U.S. Constitution. We'll talk about, the three branches of government and the concept of a separateness of powers that exist, or separation of powers, I should say. We'll talk about the power of Congress to regulate the economy under the Constitution. And we'll talk about, what power states have, in terms of how they can, influence commerce if it's something that's occurring purely within a state and not something that's interstate. So we'll distinguish those two terms, interstate and intrastate, because those are specific terms of art that have applicability for who can, kind of legislate or control that type of commercial activity. We'll talk about the role of the Supreme Court under the Supremacy Clause and how they balance, state and federal laws as they interpret the U.S. Constitution. And then finally, we'll talk about the Bill of Rights. The Bill of Rights, whenever you see that phrase, just know that that's Amendments 1 through 10. They were proposed and ratified in their entirety, all 10 together, back in 1789. And they, over the years, have been gradually applied, because originally they only applied to national government. But then with the passage of the 14th Amendment, the Due Process and the Equal Protection Clause that's contained within the 14th Amendment, the Bill of Rights gradually have been applied to the states. And the Bill of Rights also is something that protects not only us as individuals from government action, but it also protects businesses. So it has a twofold kind of purpose. This activity, I really enjoy doing this in class because I'm always curious what are some issues that are important to students, something that's near and dear to each of your hearts. And so if you could, propose an amendment to the U.S. Constitution, what would an amendment look like that you would think of? This list here, I try and save what I think are some of the top topics that students have kind of, mentioned to me over the past 3 to 4 years. And so I try and keep it as, contemporaneous as possible. Abortion is a big one, obviously, especially over the past 2 years. There's been a number of states that have enacted legislation to restrict the ability of a woman to seek that medical service. And so usually students, they're very passionate, whatever side of the issue you are on this. It usually gets some really good discussions going in class. Requiring the national government to balance their budget. Most state governments are required to balance their budgets, and so if they're going to plan to spend money, they have to kind of keep that in line with what they estimate to be the tax revenue that's going to be generated. The federal government doesn't have to do that, as evidenced by our huge national debt, which is, I think, in 2022, I think we're near $30 trillion. It's a staggering amount. But that amendment would say, no, the federal government would also have to, kind of balance their federal budget. But as of yet, we don't require the federal government to do that. Number 4 is interesting. If sometimes students like the idea of this where, one of the requirements to run for the presidency is that you have to be considered natural born. And natural born is a term of art, and I won't go into the details of it, but it's really fascinating. And hopefully you discussed it in your government class. But, most people understand natural born as, were you born in the United States or any of its territories? That's an easy that's a simple way to explain it, but it gets a lot more complex. And some people have said, well, why do we have that requirement? We're a nation that's been, when you think of our lineage, most of us, unless you're Native American, most of us have come from somewhere else. And so it seems kind of unfair, that it's like, well, why are we, kind of denying someone who might really be a good president from running for the presidency, but they had no control where they were born on this planet. I think of the actor turned politician Arnold Schwarzenegger. He's a popular actor from since the 1970s, and in the early 2000s he became governor of California, and I know he would love to have run for the presidency, but he's ineligible because he was a natural born citizen of Austria. But anyway, as of right now, you have to be considered natural born. Number 5 is interesting. This one actually did make it as a proposed amendment out of Congress in the 1970s. It was called the Equal Rights Amendment. And essentially that amendment would require public and private sectors to treat men and women equally under the law. And I'll kind of get to, the amendment process in just a minute, but it didn't quite make it all the way. And so it failed as a possible amendment to the Constitution, but it got so close to the finish line. It was kind of bittersweet. It's like it acknowledged, and reflected the status and importance of women in our society, but again, not enough states, ratified it. So it failed as a proposed amendment, unfortunately. 6 is interesting, eliminate the Electoral College. Again, hopefully you remember from your government class, it's the Electoral College that officially selects someone as President of the United States. It's not the vote of you and I. And because of that, sometimes there's controversy when the popular vote and the electoral vote do not mirror each other in terms of who the winner is of each. For much of our nation's history, we're on I think 46 presidents now. In 5 elections, the popular vote indicated a different winner than the electoral vote. And, most of the time, and again, hopefully you discuss this in your government class, most of the time that's not a big deal. You think of, 5 elections out of 46 presidents, what is really, it doesn't seem to happen that often. But think of, out of those 5 times, in 2000, George W. Bush won the electoral vote, even though Al Gore, the opponent candidate, won more popular votes. In 2016, Hillary Clinton won more popular votes, but Donald Trump won more electoral votes. And so, it's like, well, within 16 years, it's happened twice. And so, the question is, do we want to kind of have that pattern, kind of emerge where it happens with more frequency? It does kind of delegitimize a president when, they've won on I don't want to say a technicality, but they won in the Electoral College, but they didn't win with a majority of voters. And so that does kind of take a lot of wind out of the sails as someone new comes into office. But anyway, the last one is another one that's more of a recent trend, in terms of trying to protect the right to vote from infringement. Again, unfortunately, we've seen several states since the 2016 and the 2020 election want to try and enact on a state level more restrictions on the right to vote. And in terms of, you all are going to have your own individual perspectives on this, but for me, as soon as you turn 18, if you're a U.S. citizen and you're not a convicted felon, you have the right to vote, and you should not be intimidated or be afraid to exercise that right. It's an important right that we have as Americans in our democratic republic that we've created. Anyway, so in terms of, after, I discuss these different topics with students or whatever ideas they've generated that might be different from this list, we go through just very briefly how we formally amend the Constitution. So there are 2 ways to formally make a proposal. One is through Congress. And so Congress will discuss, debate, and then it's not legislation. It's basically proposing an amendment. So, let's say the Equal Rights Amendment, so Congress, the House and Senate in Washington, D.C. discussed, debated it, and 2/3 or more of each chamber voted in favor of it. And then at that point, that's the first part. The part 2 is it gets sent out to the states. And if 3/4 of the states approve it, which with 50 states, that would be 38 states. So if 38 states had approved it or ratified it, then it would have become part of the U.S. Constitution. Unfortunately, instead of 38 states, I think it got around to 32 or 33 states, and then it just kind of ran out of steam, and so it failed. The other way in which you can formally propose an amendment is if the states collectively want to kind of call a national constitutional convention, which actually we've never gone this route. It's always been initiated through Congress. But if the states feel that maybe the federal government is not doing something that they should be doing, then the states can call a national convention, and at that convention, if 2/3 of the delegates, recommend an amendment, then the Part 2 is the same. It goes to the states, and if 3/4 of the states approve it, either by having a state convention or just having a general vote for the citizens in that state, then they decide should that be an amendment or not. So, but that's how we formally make changes to the U.S. Constitution. The system we've created, we have a federal system of government, and so what that means is that there is a national layer of government. And so when you think of the main branches of government, the legislative, the judicial, and the executive branches, so Congress, the presidency, and the federal court system, they exist at the national level. And then there's also state government that has their own respective state powers. So that's the federal nature of our system. The framers were very astute when it came to understanding power and how power should not be concentrated by any one person or even any one group of persons. So, what they've done is they've created a horizontal distribution of power as well as a vertical distribution of power. And so what I mean by that is, across the three branches, that's kind of like dividing up power. Legislators, all they do is, propose, discuss, debate, and pass law. Presidents, all they do is execute the law for the most part. And then the judicial branch, they interpret law. That's all that they do. If we were North Korea, Kim Jong-un, he does everything, and it's like, well, sometimes I think in our fast-paced society, we may get frustrated with how tedious lawmaking is, but it's tedious for a reason. If think of whoever is in power, as a president, if they unilaterally could just decide, they could wake up one day and say, I want this to be law. So they just sign an edict and it becomes law. They enforce it, they interpret it, and they punish people who don't follow the law. I don't think we would want to live in that kind of society. I could be wrong, but I don't think that's the kind of just society that supports the rights of individuals and the will of the people. So that's why the framers said, well, let's divide power up. Think of like a pie. Let's cut it up and say, okay, one slice goes to Congress, one slice goes to the presidency, one slice goes to the judiciary. And on top of that, we also, diffuse power, from the top down. So there's federal power, there's state power, there's local power. So again, no one level of government or no one section of government controls everything. And so that's the remarkable kind of like perspective or framework that the framers had, was that they really understood what power does to persons. Even if you're the most, kind, intuitive, compassionate, very, thoughtful person, if you're given power, the lure, the temptation of power is that once you have it, you don't want to lose it. And as you have it, you'd like to accumulate more. And so there's always that temptation. And so the structure of our system of government, kind of hardwired into our framework of governing, prevents that, kind of like temptation. I've heard former presidents, kind of reflect on, the power, that they have as president, and then as they leave office. And most former presidents agree that it's a good thing that, we restrict the power of Congress, we restrict the power of presidents, we restrict the power of courts, because if we didn't, everyone knows what that temptation is. You want to kind of accumulate more and more power and potentially abuse that power. Anyway, so federalism, separation of powers, judicial review, those are, kind of like the core kind of like principles that have been embraced in our system of government under the U.S. Constitution. So this is more of a visual. There's not really much to add here, but, for those of you that like to kind of see things kind of laid out, this is, how we've kind of divided power up across the three branches. And again, we could create a system where power is just in one branch. I mean, you could have a unitary system of government where all the power is at the national level, and there is no power for regional or like state and local governments. Great Britain, for example, much of Great Britain's existence, they've had a unitary system of government, and so there's the Parliament, and so there's House of Commons, House of Lords. And then, that kind of, determines policy across the entire United Kingdom. Recent years, they've experimented with devolution, but again, I don't get off into that because that's like more of a government thing. But anyway, 3 branches of government here in the U.S. Some terms that I want to make sure you understand as you read this chapter. So, at the federal level of government, the national government has certain powers that are called enumerated. And enumerated means that they are specifically spelled out in the Constitution as powers that belong to the federal government. So I say federal and national, and those terms are synonymous. Taxing of goods and services, for import, if there's any kind of burden on interstate commerce or the regulation of interstate commerce, those are examples of, enumerated powers. Delegated powers are powers during the Constitutional Convention. The delegates, who represented states said, the delegated powers, these are powers that, are just out of practicality should belong to the national government and not to state governments. So like the idea of declaration of war or coining of money. Imagine if we had separate state currencies. That would be terribly inefficient in our modern, post-information interconnected society that we're in. And so, imagine if you, were a business here in Orlando and you were selling, a good or service to maybe, companies or persons in Georgia. Imagine if you had to convert currency, to buy or sell stuff, from Georgia or from any other state. It would be very inefficient, and it would add to the cost of the transaction. When you think of when the South seceded, and that led to the Civil War, the Southern states all have their own individual currencies, and again, I guess hindsight is 20/20, but why would you create a system where you have to convert currency for states that you're in an alliance with? It doesn't make sense. You're setting yourself up to fail. Which obviously is what happened. But anyway, there's efficiency in just having one common currency across the United States. Congress is the one that actually, declares war with consultation with the president. Presidents obviously wage war, so do understand that. Sometimes I have students make the comment that presidents declare war, and that actually is not true. It's a congressional decision to declare war or not. Shared powers, there are a number of powers that are delegated that belong to both states and national government. So think of like taxation and environment. Any level of government can tax us. And we also have national, like an environmental protection agency, as well as state and local EPAs. And, in concert, they work together to try and keep the environment as clean as possible for us. Prohibited powers, no ex post facto, no bills of attainder, no habeas corpus. And so ex post facto is a principle that if a law is passed, it cannot be retroactive in terms of if it punishes persons. So if you want to pass a law today that says ice cream is illegal, you can do that. Congress could do that today if they wanted to. And so, on my Instagram page or my TikTok, if I posted yesterday me eating ice cream, once that law passes, they can't arrest me and say, well, we have proof that you broke the law a day before we passed this law. That would be unfair. That's ex post facto. If after the law passes, if I continue to post pictures on Instagram and videos on TikTok of me eating ice cream, then of course I can be arrested because I'm breaking law that currently exists. But if the law doesn't exist at the time that you did something, there can be no punishment then. No bills of attainder. That's the actual language out of Article 1 in the Constitution. It says there shall be no bills of attainder. A bill of attainder under the common law, and that's the bulk of our system of law that we've kind of brought over from the United Kingdom. Bill of attainder means that you can be punished without the benefit of a trial. And in our system of government, we think that that's grossly unfair, and that every person and business should have the right to a trial if we're accusing them of breaking whatever law or regulation it is that they're being charged with. So that's what's meant by there shall be no bills of attainder. Again, I like to give examples in class, and so I give the example of, let's say, I leave class one day from Valencia and I go to 7-Eleven and I decide I want to rob 7-Eleven. So I walk in and I brandish a firearm, and I wave it around. I take money from the register. I get a Slurpee. I get a hot dog, and I'm running out of 7-Eleven, and a cop just happens to pull up, my bad luck, and sees everything. And so they tackle me to the ground, they cuff me, they arrest me, and they take me to the county jail for processing. There's no question I just robbed 7-Eleven. It's on video. We're eyewitnesses. Police actually saw me as they pulled up. When I'm presented in front of a judge and the judge asks me how I want to plead, I can say not guilty. It wasn't me. And everybody there knows it was me. And so even though it might be a ridiculous kind of charade that we have to kind of go through, that's the premise of our system, is that every person, if they want a trial, if they're being accused of a crime, then they're entitled to have their day in court if they so choose. Now, I can plead guilty. I can try and do a plea bargain. There's a lot of things that I can do that I don't have to do. Those are optional type things. But I can insist that I want my day in court. I want a trial. Maybe there was a reason. I don't know. But that's no bills of attainder. And habeas corpus, that's another Latin phrase, which means you have the body. And once government seizes you, so you're under arrest, then you have a very limited time window. It's usually about 72 hours in which you have the right to appear in front of a judge. And the judge will make a determination, is or was the arrest valid? Was there probable cause for the arrest? And so that's habeas corpus. Excuse me. The last one there, federal supremacy. Normally, we have federal law, we have state law, and they kind of regulate their own kind of domains or spheres. When you think of sovereignty. Pardon me. And so there are times, however, when a federal law comes into conflict with a state law. And normally what happens is there usually is litigation. So, the state or the federal government will sue. And then it's up to the judge to make a determination. And almost always the determination under the supremacy clause is that the federal law will prevail over the state or local law. So think of great example in the news over the past year involves voting rights. There have been many states, even here in Florida, states that have proposed on a state level new restrictions on the right to vote. If Congress were to pass a law, saying that there's an unfettered right to the right to vote, as long as the person is 18 years old and as long as they're a citizen of the United States, then those state laws that contradict that federal law, those state laws would become unenforceable, and states would have to abide by the federal law. You could try and challenge it, but again, that's federal supremacy. That's hardwired into the Constitution, and so there's really no wiggle room there to try and get out of that. When we think of the court system, the big tool that the court system has, and this is both state and federal courts, is judicial review. Judicial review is the ability of the courts to determine if a law passed by a legislature or an action by an executive, so governor or president or mayor, is constitutional or not. And so, I think of the court system, and especially I think of the U.S. Supreme Court, I think of them like referees. And I think of the Constitution as like the playbook or the rule book for the sport that we're engaged in, which is government. And so, Congress or state legislature will do something, and then someone will challenge it because we love to sue in the United States. And then at that point, it's the court system. They have to act as like the referee or the judge and say, did the state action, is that compliant with our rule system, which is the Constitution, or not? And it's either yes or no. It's a fairly simple kind of analysis. At least superficially, it's a kind of like an easy analysis. If you're an actual judge, there are usually two kind of perspectives as you interpret the Constitution. There's a bedrock view and there's a living document view. Bedrock view tends to be embraced by more conservative jurists. And when I say jurist, that's another reference or another way to describe a judge or a justice. Usually, if you're on a Supreme Court, so like a state Supreme Court or the U.S. Supreme Court, those judges are called justices. Any judge below a Supreme Court level, they're just called judges. So again, just so you get the vernacular of the terminology. Anyway, so the bedrock view is a very literal, let's read the Constitution for only the words it contains. Living document is, more of a progressive type interpretation of the Constitution and subsequent amendments, so that it kind of looks at, well, how has society changed, now that it's the 21st century and no longer the 18th century when the Constitution was first drafted. And a great example of this, and I'll give you one example to kind of distinguish how a conservative justice would read something differently than a living document justice. So let's take the Third Amendment. It's an amendment that's unique because it's never been litigated in the United States. And that's the amendment that prevents government from the quartering of soldiers. And so, when we were colonials, so pre-independence, the British, military regularly would show up at someone's farm or their home, and they might need a place to sleep. And so they would just barge in your home, sleep in your bed, eat your food, do whatever. And then when they're done, they leave, next day or a few days or however long they stayed there. And once we gained our independence, we felt that was a gross violation of the sanctity of our homes. When you think of, special places in the United States for you and I as individuals, our home is our most special place. Whether it's if it's a mansion, if it's a condominium, if it's an apartment, if it's a mobile home, as long as it's a fixed structure of some kind, a townhouse, cabin, that's a very special place. And under the Third Amendment, it says there's no quartering of soldiers. So if there is a case that's brought before, the Supreme Court involving, the U.S. military crashing into people's homes, sleeping for the night, which has never happened, that'd be a pretty easy case to resolve. Third Amendment, you can't do that. If you ask a bedrock or a conservative justice, what is the scope of the Third Amendment? And they would just answer, well, the government can't quarter soldiers. That's it. If you ask a living document jurist or justice, they would say that, plus, they would get into, well, why is that even an amendment? And they would say, the living document justice, they would say, well, the reason why it's an amendment is that the home is a special place and government should generally stay out of your home. They have no right to be there unless you invite them in, And so that's where you see the difference between bedrock and living document type of perspectives when it comes to justices. If police want to do a no-knock, kind of barge and enter, search of your home, think of all the different ways in which government wants to come into your home, not just soldiers crashing for the night. There is definite, merit, I think, to trying to kind of, you've got to balance, obviously what literally the Constitution and the amendments say. Certainly you have to do that. But then you also have to kind of apply it because our society has drastically changed. In 1787, when the Constitution was ratified, most of us were farmers, and so we were very dispersed, small populous nation over a very wide area of territory. And so, we're very different now. We have a much more modern, complex society, and, we can't apply rules, at least this is my opinion. I don't mean to push my beliefs on each of you, but I don't believe that we can impose, an 18th century mindset on the 21st century society. I don't think that's fair to us today, because we have differing expectations, we have differing needs than people ever could have imagined in the 18th century. So, but anyway, that's the different ways in which we can interpret the Constitution. So we went through the formal amendment process just a few slides ago, in terms of going through Congress or through a national convention. Judicial interpretation also has the ability to amend the Constitution. So think of all the many different court cases that have kind of funneled through the Supreme Court. One that comes to mind is Texas v. Johnson. Texas v. Johnson is an interesting case in that Johnson in 1984, he was in Dallas, Texas, and it was the summer leading up to President Reagan's election, or I should say re-election, and which he did win. But Johnson was not a supporter of Reagan, and so outside the convention hall in Dallas, where the Republican National Convention was being held, he took out an American flag and burned it. So he was arrested. Texas had a law that said you cannot burn the Texas flag. That was obviously most important. And then 2, you cannot burn the American flag, secondary. And so he was charged, convicted. He didn't deny it. It wasn't an accident or anything like that. And the punishment is a year in jail. So that was his punishment. And so, he appeals. He says, this is unfair. I have a First Amendment right. And so if you've read the First Amendment, we know that there's, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of the press, freedom of association, and the right to redress grievances. There are 5 core freedoms that are contained within the First Amendment. So they pack a lot in that. But nowhere does it say you have the right to symbolic speech. And that's what burning the flag is. If you're burning the flag, generally, as an adult, you are protesting some policy of the U.S. government. The other cases where they're burning the flag, the U.S. flags are being burned, that's usually a Boy Scout thing, because there's a ceremonial way of disposing of tattered flags that involve incineration. But that's not what we're talking about. So the Supreme Court sided with Johnson, and they said that the First Amendment does include the right to symbolic speech. And so that includes burning the American flag. That includes wearing maybe peace armbands if you protest a war. That supports sit-ins. And obviously there are limits to all of these rights. There's no right in the Bill of Rights that is unfettered. Whether it's a First Amendment right, Second Amendment, everything is subject to restrictions. Everything. But because of that case, Texas v. Johnson, the First Amendment was expanded. We could have had an amendment that said you have the right to burn the American flag, but obviously that didn't happen. But that Supreme Court decision supports a person's right to burn the American flag. The final way, which is mentioned in the text, is by practice. And, the best way to explain this, and I'll give an example, is if you do something wrong long enough and everyone says it's okay, then we're okay with it. President Washington, our first president, the fearless commander that, was instrumental in the defeat of the British military, obviously with his soldiers, but his leadership was just, it was indescribable. And when he became president of the United States, he's Washington. He's a hero. And one of the requirements of a president is that as you deal with other countries, from time to time, you'll enter into treaties. And normally how it goes is that a president will, with the advice and consent of the U.S. Senate, not the House, but just the Senate, they'll work together with another country to form a treaty. And a treaty is just a contract. It could be for trade, it could be for immigration, it could be for, an alliance, it could be whatever. And so Washington didn't like to deal with the Senate. So what he would do is he would work with another country. They would hammer out an agreement, and then he would go to the Senate and say, would you please approve this and ratify it? And the Senate did that because, again, it was Washington. My goodness. Who's going to argue with him? I wouldn't. So technically, that's not how it's supposed to work. But, again, Washington did it. Adams comes into the presidency after Washington. And, Adams basically says, well, Washington did it this way, so I'm doing it this way. and every president since then have done it the same way. So that's kind of a cautionary tale when we talk about by practice. Is that I try and tell students, it's like, well, we should be very careful what we allow presidents to do, because if it becomes a standard practice, then future presidents are going to say, well, that person did it, so I'm going to do it that way. And it may be a good thing, or it may not be a good thing. It's better to kind of follow whatever the rules that we have established under the Constitution and its subsequent amendments. As I mentioned, the first 10 amendments provide protections not only for individuals but for businesses. There was a court case, I believe it was back in 2011, 2012. It was called Citizens United versus FEC. FEC means it's an acronym for the Federal Election Commission. And in that particular court case, there was an existing law that restricted the ability of businesses to spend money on political campaigns. And so we wanted to try and have some kind of dividing line in the sand when it came to money and politics. And one line was, well, let's just keep corporations out of politics as much as possible. Individuals, you can make donations. There's obviously, that's good. That's been going on for forever, it seems. And so in Citizens United versus the FEC, the Supreme Court sided with Citizens United. That was a group represented a business interest. And so that pretty much opened the floodgates when it comes to First Amendment expression. Money is speech is kind of like the lingo that comes out of the Citizens United case. But that case reinforced this idea that all of the amendments apply to not only us as individuals, but it also applies to businesses. So huge kind of watershed case that has had huge implications in how candidates raise money. The theory of why critics don't like the Citizens United case is that, if you're running for office, if you're running for governor, if you're running for the Senate, if you're running for the presidency, the House of Representatives, the U.S. Senate, whatever the position is, you can get a lot more money potentially from businesses than you can from individuals. And so why not just focus on businesses, because that's where you can get a lot of money, and then with that money you can buy advertising and you can hopefully persuade people to vote for you. The reality is that I don't know, do you want to have politicians that are kind of beholden to businesses more than they are to individual voters? And again, that's what you have to decide as individual voters when you vote for candidates. The last slide that I have in this chapter, in terms of limitations on government, the 5th and the 14th Amendments, they basically require that no person shall be denied life, liberty, or property without the due process of law. And so part of the 5th Amendment, is like, you're protected from self-incrimination. You might hear people say either in news events, or it could be in TV shows or movies, pop culture. Someone will say, I plead the 5th. And what that means is I don't have to help you convict me. So I'm going to just exercise my right to remain silent. Businesses have that right too, with the exception, though, if it's something that they're being regulated for. Normally, you can't say I have a Fifth Amendment right not to cooperate. And like the best example there is OSHA, Occupational Safety and Health Administration. OSHA, their singular purpose as a federal agency is to improve workplace safety. That's it. And so if OSHA comes into, your restaurant and says, we want to see your accident log, we want to see who has been injured at this site, whether it be an employee or a customer, we just want to see what happened. We're not saying you did anything wrong. We just want to see what type, whether it's slip and fall, what happened here. And if you're the business, you can't say, well, get a search warrant. I'm not going to cooperate. Well, that's why OSHA, regulates all businesses, and they come in and they say, we want to just know what's happening here. Their singular purpose is to try and help you devise ways to make the workplace more safe. That's it. They're not there to charge you or convict you of anything. There's no grand conspiracy. They just want to make sure as people clock in for work that they don't unnecessarily get hurt. That's all it is. The other thing is equal protection. So the Constitution requires every level of government to apply the law equally, and that includes not only citizens, but also it does include businesses. So anyway, I hope I kind of went along on this. I really like to talk about government, so I I ask for your forgiveness in that regard. But if you do have any additional questions, please feel free to reach out to me anytime. I, as you know, enjoy talking about this. But thank you for listening to this discussion on Chapter 4 and the Constitution and how it impacts U.S. commerce.